Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the most important conversation here in Davos, leading through crisis, what works and what doesn't. I'm Sara Pantulian, I'm the Chief Executive at ODI, and I want to welcome, first of all, everyone who is gathered around this table in Davos, but also our online audience that I know is very numerous today that is joining us through the ODI website. We are really, really grateful to MasterCard for hosting us in the Hub Culture in the Tech Lodge here. Fantastic space for these important conversations. But I'm really grateful to all of you around the table, leaders and executives that have taken time out of crazy schedules here in Davos to join these conversations. We reached to each of you because you have some really unique perspectives to this challenge. And I think this is a challenge that could be more timely or important. I mean, we've seen over this past decade a number of really interconnected, quite unique challenges, crises that become the new normal very much. And citizens are looking to their leaders to make sense of this crisis, but they're struggling to get the leadership that they're hoping for. And so there is a growing sense that we need fresh approaches, to navigate through, particularly against the backdrop of technological advancement. If you walk on the promenade, everything is like generative AI, right? So this strong leadership is needed now more than ever to tackle inequality, to tackle injustice, if you don't want them to get entrenched. So last year at ODI, we launched Tandem. Tandem is our executive leadership development program because we want to try and help the leaders of the humanitarian and development sectors in particular to become the better leader of tomorrow. It's a program supported by USAID, and really we seek to make it become the premier training ground for tomorrow's leaders. We know that the most pressing challenges that we're facing today globally, from the climate emergency to the breakdown in peace and security, polarization, racial injustice, we can't address them in isolation. We can't address them, in isolated sectors, which is why we have a cross-section of, industries represented around this table. And through Tandem, we want to equip those who are on the front line of some of these not just challenges, responding to humanitarian crisis, trying to help countries on their development trajectory, really have the skills, to collaborate with others to bring about lasting change. So the conversation today, what are the traits of an effective leader in this particular, historical moment and for the uncertain future that we face? You all have a wealth of experience across a range of industries, and we're going to use your insights to continue to refine the Tandem program. I want to start by introducing some very special guest speakers that we have with us. Farthest to my left, Mark Mallow-Brown, Lord Mark Mallow-Brown, President of the Open Society Foundations. Next to Mark is Tiana Huang, the Executive Director of Human Rights Watch. To my immediate left, Amy Pope, very first woman, Director General of the International Organization for Migration. And to my right, I have Andrew Levy, the Chief Corporate of Government Affairs Officer at Accenture. Thank you so much for joining us to help provoke the conversation. But before we get stuck in the conversation, I'm going to go to Jeremy Hillman, who is the MasterCard Senior Vice President of External Engagement, who is going to kick us off with some opening remarks. We're really delighted to be partnering with you today for this event, Jeremy.
Thank you, Sarah. And it's fantastic to host you and ODI and your great team here, a lot of great friends and partners around the table. So we've had some amazing conversations here in this MasterCard Tech Lodge this week around cybersecurity, around financial health, around sustainability. But I think in some ways, this conversation today is almost the most important, the idea of showing leadership in these troubled times. And so I'm really excited to sort of host this right now. I think we probably all agree we need more and better leadership. We've not stayed ahead of some really challenging issues. We've not stayed ahead of misinformation. We have not stayed ahead of some climate and sustainability issues before now. And we've not stayed ahead of some really challenging geopolitical tensions that have caused a lot of, misery for lives and livelihoods. So, how do we do that? And where is the optimism to draw? And I think there is optimism. And I think we've seen a lot of it here this week in Davos. I remember being here a couple of years ago, and all along the promenade, it was crypto. Here it's AI. And I think it's an effort that we are that we see a new and transformative technology, and there's a real willingness and to get ahead of this technology and think about how we're building an inclusive digital ecosystem and managing the risks and leveraging the opportunities of this new technology. So, I won't speak for long, but look, I think MasterCard, I think probably we think that we've really, to show leadership, we really have to work on our core, take from our core expertise. So, we work in important areas like small business and data for social impact and financial inclusion. We believe that showing leadership is really utilizing the core skills and capacities we have. We're really proud to be celebrating 10 years of the Center for Inclusive Growth this year. And so, really happy to be hosting this conversation, and I'll pass it back to you, but thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much. MasterCard is really leading the way of bringing together different industries on the financial inclusion in particular. Let's get started. To my featured speakers, as we're calling them. So, as I said, this is a particular moment of geopolitical uncertainty. So, what are the traits that leaders need to successfully steer organizations, companies, institutions, and tell us, what lessons have you learned in your leadership journey? Mark, can I start with you?
Well, I got to study at the feet of the master, which was Kofi Anan. And, there were two traits I learned, I'm not sure I learned, but I observed in him. One was an extraordinary capacity for empathetic listening, an immediate understanding of where two highly opposed people or countries, there might be some overlap of interests to press on, but it came from listening, and beyond it, a great willingness to begin any conversation with how are your family, how are you, before turning to the business of the day. So there was a humanity which I think often gets lost. The second, I think, issue was to constantly, and I often use this phrase that I learned from him, which, he claimed was an African aphorism. I sometimes wonder whether it really was or whether he just invented it and made it up. But you always used to say you can't change the wind, but you can bend the sail. And, it's all about, recognizing the realities you faced, but finding a way to navigate through them rather than exhausting yourself trying to bang up against the wind or a brick wall time after time. But as you navigate, to remember that if you are a UN leader, not most notably Secretary General, but anyone, or in a human rights space or anything, navigation mustn't mean betrayal of fundamental principles. So take that, and I will just very quickly to today. And I think even he would be daunted by the many dimensions of the crisis today. And it makes me add one other fact to it, which is, the need both to understand the sort of interconnectedness and multi-sectoral nature of what is happening, to recognize that apparently disparate events, from a war in the Middle East to one in Ukraine to the hottest year on record, to there are interlinkages between these. There are roots about within the breakdown of the current system of governance and economics in the world, and to recognize that and to try and ride it in ways which allow new approaches to emerge, but in doing so to be very disciplined, because it's so easy to dissipate our energies over firefighting in 100 different directions, and to instead set your navigation point towards something you in your sector can achieve, which will contribute to the resolution of that much bigger crisis of which we can only feel the immediate part we touch in our work. Seems to me critical. And finally, just thank you for having set up this initiative. I think it's great to have an executive training of this kind, and bravo to you and USAID.
Thanks, Mark. And it's fantastic to be able to learn, from all of you who've tried and have so much experience. And I can see that, these incredible words of Kofi Anan will be used, throughout the training and beyond. I will take them, to help steer my own organization for a start. And Tiana, Mark talked about the challenge, in particularly for those who lead, rights organizations, and having to obviously make sure that we stay sort of truthful to your principles. What are your takeaway on leadership, and what you can sort of share from your journey?
It's a big question, actually. I mean, one of the things that I think is making particularly the rights movement at the moment, and to lead a human rights organization, such a challenge, is that the assault on human rights is coming from multiple directions. So yes, we have big conflicts, which are obviously polarizing the world and dominating the narrative. And those sort of larger, they are also, the conflicts that we're seeing, are polarizing conversations and community in business, in everyone's organization, in our communities, in our schools. And so that resonates throughout all organizations. But at a whole, like the fundamental idea of human rights is also being challenged and chipped away at. So right now, I mean, the thing that we have to hold on to is being able to articulate our principles, and and being able to push back. And that is actually, and being able to find that, Mark alluded to it, what is your North Star? And I think being able to articulate and define your North Star, both as an organization, so that you know what it is that we're rallying around. It is so easy in a fragmented world for everyone to know, what is our business, or what is our organization do. But you risk in a polarized world having your workforce of, whether it's 50 people or 650 people or 1,050 people, turning up, everybody with a different idea of why they come to work and what our organization should do. And one of the things about articulating our principles and being able to articulate your North Star is you don't say it once, you say it every day. And we need to make sure that in every decision and every conversation that we're having, we start those conversations is, how is that leading us towards our purpose? And so, I think that if we can ground ourselves in our principle and our purpose, that's the first thing, and we need to constantly remind us of it. If I can talk on an issue of culture for a minute, because we cannot deliver on our mission unless we have a healthy internal cultures. And in such a polarized world, one of the things I think that we need to invest in now more than ever is making sure that we can have difficult conversations with respect. That we know that when we disagree, that there can be disagreement, but we also know that those disagreements don't just linger and hang, at a point where people feel powerless. They're the people we work for, they're the people we work with. I think it's really important that we need to create space for the conversations that happen, for people to be able to voice their concerns. But then we have to take decisions. We have to be able to take decisions and articulate our rationales why. And as leaders, being able to articulate that rationale and our why, even if people disagree, I see, smart, intelligent colleagues and partners who, they understand the why. And people move on and they make better decisions. And I want to say one thing is that I've seen leadership emerge across the sector and across my own organization from all sorts of levels. And I think in the moment of challenge and crisis, that's another thing we need to do, is not all leadership responsibility sits with those of us with, wearing the big hat. We need to continue to nurture the leadership that is throughout our organizations. And lastly, I want to talk about one thing that's happening to the human rights movement. And I talked about this regression. And that is a challenge. How do we lead when you feel you're always on the back foot, when you feel you're on the defensive? And I think that is really a principle of being bold. if you want to hold the line when it comes to, you know, protecting our principles, protecting human rights, protecting open and free societies, we need to be talking about being bold and being principled and not being scared. We are currently in an environment, and this will be my last point, where there's a real danger that we can be silent so that we're not wrong. And I think that that might be the most dangerous thing that will compound the crises that we're in. And that happens at all levels. That's happening when we see governments sort of chipping away at civil society space. And actually, I was just having a conversation about this, and then we find our partners, our organizations being scared, saying, if I stick my head up, will the government come after me? That happens in discussions internally. Well, if I say something, you know, will something happen to me? That's happening. We're seeing these examples everywhere. And I think you can be principled, speak out about it. But I want to raise one other thing, which I read in an article recently. It's really stuck with me. And it's pushing back against know your place aggression. There is this concept where people who are speaking out in principled ways, people who are talking about the unpopular issues, people who are pushing back against repression, are told, well, that's not your place. And if people, and if other leaders in other organizations, and if community is not prepared to stand up and say that's not acceptable, when somebody's bold enough to stick their head above the pulpit, then I think I think that's the backsliding, and we have an opportunity to push back.
Thank you very much, Tiana, for that sobering reminder. Amy, there's so much wisdom already shared by Mark and Tiana. What resonates for you? You knew the helm of IOM, but you have a long leadership journey to share with us as well.
So one of the best pieces of advice I got in a former job was you don't step off the curb until you know where you're going, which I actually find quite useful, and particularly in an organization where we deal with a lot of humanitarian crisis, which means it's effectively a variation on this theme of what's your North Star, but it's a little bit more specific than that. It is what is the world that we are hoping to create? And what are the key pieces of it? What does it look like concretely? And then even as we are responding in the midst of humanitarian crisis, all the actions that we are taking are grounded in the outcome that we are trying to see. So in the migration space, I think that's absolutely critical, because at this moment in time, if you were to read the headlines in any country, by the way, not just in the global north, but all over the world, you would believe that migration is this terribly destructive force that must be stopped. When overwhelmingly, the evidence shows us that migration is this incredibly powerful force for development and for good. And ultimately, our job at the International Organization for Migration is to figure out how we enable the unlocking of the tremendous human potential that comes when people move. It's complicated by the fact that we do this in the context of humanitarian disaster. And we know that when people are moving quickly, when people are moving without plans or strategy, that there are challenges that communities face, whether it's the host community, whether it's the government or the migrants themselves. So it's not to be so, wear the rose-colored glasses and think, oh, what's happening in Sudan is actually a good thing. I mean, what's happening in Sudan is a very complicating, challenging thing, particularly for the people on the move. But if you just stop for a moment and realize, I was in Chad last week, a number of Chadians, half of the people who migrated from Chad went to Sudan in search of better economic opportunities and better education. So if you stop for a moment and you think those people who are now coming back from Sudan into Chad very likely have additional economic skills and languages and education and other experiences. So how do we move from just responding to their immediate humanitarian need and giving them a blanket to how do we mobilize and empower these people who are coming back across so they can actually be part of the development of Chad? right? So that's the way I want to reframe this. Where do we want to go? And then whether it's in humanitarian response, whether it's in the planning and understanding displacement factors, or whether it's then very proactively identifying pathways for migration, then that unlock human potential and human development. Keeping that in mind, despite there's a phrase one of my good friends uses, despite the ankle biting that's happening, despite the negative headlines, despite the emergency that we're facing. And so that then when we're reacting, what we're doing is ultimately another brick in the road toward the outcome.
Thank you so much. I'll come back to you on some questions on migration and leadership. But Andrew, Accenture is a really, really important partner in Tandem, and for a reason, because we felt that to help the humanitarian leaders, the development leaders, we also want to learn from the private sector. And so we really want to hear some of the specific traits that the private sector thinks are important for leaders and how we can use them for our humanitarian development leaders.
Well, thank you, first of all, for inviting me. The comments already have been amazing. And I think it's great to have some corporate representation here, because as we'll talk about, there's a role that we can play individually, and I think particularly powerfully collectively. But what's interesting is the remarks reflect, you hit about every point that I would have said if I was to go first. So Accenture actually and WEF did some work together on what are the traits of responsible, modern responsible leaders. I mean, just to paraphrase, mission, which we heard, an inclusive mindset, because the number of stakeholders that have to be addressed and learned from is greater than ever, from employees to if you're a public company, shareholders to others. Learning, listening and learning. I think we live in an era where things are changing so fast with technology and otherwise, that having a learning mindset is essential. Not just for leaders, by the way, but at Accenture anyway, that's throughout the company is something we try to inculcate. Empathy and say responsible innovation, right? So I think we heard that all in different ways from the group. I'll also say, and Tiana and I were talking a bit about this before, the point about being able to have difficult conversations, very important. I would say, especially with recent events, that's been something that we've been struggling with. I mean, we have a very truly human culture, as we say, and we work very hard to cultivate that at our company, which I should have said at the beginning. Accenture is about almost 800,000 people globally. So we're kind of a small country within ourselves, with very diverse views, diverse everything, which makes it a wonderful place. But we experience internally everything that would play out around the world, basically in a microcosm. So that's been challenging at different periods, and I think right now in particular. So that's something we haven't quite solved exactly how you do that, but encouraging open dialogue with respect is really important. So everything I've heard so far is, I think, really encompasses what it means.
Thanks. Fantastic to see that there is some validation also in the corporate sector. I just have a quick follow-up question for each of you. Mark, this is defined as the age of polycrisis. You lead a very important philanthropy in this context. What are some of the most difficult trade-offs you've had to make?
Well, I mean, I think an obvious one, given the sort of human rights dimension of some of this conversation, is the challenge to traditional human rights. Tiana and I have discussed this a lot, and we find Human Rights Watch and OSF are pursuing a very similar strategic journey. In fact, I even read Tiana's objectives to my board and pretended they were mine until they'd all affirmed how brilliant it was. And then I said, actually, I've stolen them from HRW, but to make a point, which was, just how the old model of naming and shaming on human rights and the focus on political and civil versus economic and social just didn't do justice to the nature of this crisis, with, where the old sort of north-south hierarchies of power are gone, and where, people are looking at so many issues through the lens of theirs and their families' economic security and well-being, rather than through the abstracts of something like human rights, as an abstract principle to determine your support or not for your government, etc. So to sort of move how we operate to understand that the model has totally changed, and that we've got to lobby new kinds of constituencies that we'd ignored in the past around new kinds of issues, has been really difficult, because, both Human Rights Watch and OSF, were enormous successes of that old model. I mean, we rode to power or influence on the back of the fall of the Berlin Wall, end of apartheid in South Africa, and a simple world where we could say, we can strengthen civil society and get governments to just pass simple, human rights legislation, then civil society will hold governments to account via the ballot box. And that model simply doesn't work for all sorts of reasons, too complicated to go into now. But in that, in that context, forcing not just oneself, but all of one's colleagues to totally rethink how we deliver our mission, is challenging, but necessary.
Absolutely. Tiana, you've just published the World Report 2024. And one thing that struck me is that you really highlighted the double standards, the selective outrage, I think you call it, that we've seen from our leaders in recent times. Of course, the Gaza crisis is on the minds of everyone. What do we need to demand a better response from our leaders?
So, what the double standards is the most obvious part, because that is when governments are actually public, so that's when you actually can see it. I think that where we need to stop and what enables the double standards to perpetuate is something that we refer to as transactional diplomacy. And I think that transactional diplomacy is unfortunately one of the trends that we have seen picking up globally. There's not a single region in the world. And what transactional diplomacy actually means is that governments are choosing to ignore human rights that are happening when they are happening with a potential partner that they need to advance their own sort of domestic agenda. And I mean, actually, migration is a key example of that. Here we are, we find ourselves and we see multiple examples. And let's just take the EU for one. The EU migration deals, instead of addressing the backsliding of human rights that we have seen in Tunisia, the outright repression that we see in Egypt, the litany of human rights abuses, including, torture and mistreatment of migrants and refugees in places like Libya. Instead of the European Union, addressing the human rights concerns there, they turn a blind eye so that they can actually develop, partnerships and contracts to ensure that these countries will hold migrants and asylum seekers back so that they don't enter the European bloc. And that is simply just an enabling environment for rights abusing governments. So when you think about, what can you do differently? It's very easy. Principled approaches. These are international standards. When it comes to human rights, these aren't nice to haves. These are international obligations. And so we need to be holding all governments to the same standards, because if you don't, it simply emboldens rights. When we see backsliding, if we ignore that, what comes after that is attacks on institutions, the institutions that we rely on, the courts and independent media, for example. They attack the institutions we rely on to create open and free societies. So ensuring that we're holding all governments to the same standards. We're not creating carve-outs, that governments are not allowing carve-outs and free passes just to allow advancement of their own agendas. And also I think that there's a role to play from everyone, and that is you have to make the cost of human rights abuses higher. You can do that through, speaking out. I think that corporates have a role to play here, ensuring that there is human rights at the center of your operations. And of course, I think, making sure that the consistent application of rights and that there is accountability when there are rights abuses is going to be key.
Thanks. You mentioned migration and, particularly in terms of the countries of origin, but you said something else about the human potential that is unlocked with migration that is really difficult to get leaders to accept. How are we going to help them reframe the debate around migration?
So first of all, it's probably not us who will do it, right? I mean, as good as we all are, and we are, right? We are not the ones who are going to change their minds. And it's why, for example, I'm here for this week, because I see the power of changing the narrative actually in groups like the private sector, because it's the private sector who benefits when migration works well. It's the private sector that creates the jobs. It's the private sector that needs a sustainable workforce, and the private sector that needs continued innovation, right? And so I think I'm betting that the private sector is going to be the more effective advocate for migration as a tool for development than any of us who say, yeah, governments, you really should do a better job, because that's the right thing to do, right? I'm appealing to economic self-interest. So we start there. The second is the communications about this. We, as the International Organization for Migration, I believe, have a responsibility to communicate how and why and where migration can work. I think in the past, we've fallen into the trap of communicating only about the disasters, communicating only about people who died in boats crossing the Mediterranean or the Channel or showing up on the border. And this is not to take away from the value of the lives that were lost, and it is not to normalize the death or harm that is happening to people on the move, but it's to move away from that narrative that migration is only about death and destruction and loss, and really look for the examples of where it's actually driving tremendous human outcomes in capitals and countries and small towns all around the world, right? And not just in Europe, but also in Europe, right? I think the other thing is really embracing technology. I mean, this is the Davos of AI. By the way, I think it's also the Davos of the poly crisis, because I keep hearing this word being repeated over and over again. But and then someone said we need polyamory to respond to the poly crisis. So, but right, exactly. But I think we need to be embracing AI, for example, as a tool to help us solve and address the problem. So again, sticking with migration, the way we work is when the way I think this will work is when we can connect people who are looking for opportunities and the skills that they have with the opportunities that exist. Now, that's really hard to do if we're just relying on researchers and economists and, sort of old ways
Wrong
of
with
working.
them, of course.
Yeah, all of that is necessary. But I think the game changer will be when we use AI to help us do this faster and help us do it in real time, so we can help create more real-time opportunities. And then finally, last thing, it's all about the partnerships, right? We can be the best IOM in the world. I think we're pretty good at what we do, but it's not going to be us alone. It's going to be engaging with all of you. It will be engaging with governments, engaging with mayors, engaging community leaders, and of course, the migrants themselves.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, when we were advertising the event online, a colleague, sort of commented, well, if it is the age of the poly crisis, it didn't say, polyamory, but he said, what we need is collective leadership. So how we, sort of really engineer these partnerships that can bring collective leadership. So Amy talks about, the importance of the corporates. We've seen this week, we've seen the Edelman Trust Barometer. We'll hear, more about it in a second. It found that businesses are the only institution that is seen as competent and ethical. Big responsibility. So how can businesses use this position to drive collective action?
Great question, and a lot to unpack and respond to actually in the last comments. I guess to put in context a little bit, that idea of like a reduction in credibility of governments in particular. I was reading an article that talked about, I tried to explain the geopolitical tensions that we're having, and they cited sort of the structural issues, and I think they're relevant because one was that the governments or the institutions, some of them that we would traditionally have relied on, no longer reflect the balance of power in the world, global south rising, China, et cetera, right? And the issues they're being asked to address, climate, technology, are ones that they don't have any basis to build on. So they're kind of building from scratch. And together, there's a lot of tension there. So I think that it gets to the point of needing a more inclusive approach to all these issues. But leaders of businesses have a lot, it is a challenge, right? Because you have to do a lot of things at once. You have to run a business, just obviously. You have to look for growth in an environment where it's not, where there are challenges to that. And then you have to try to address these social and economic issues. I think the point that Amy was sort of getting at is if you can align your mission with some of these efforts, because it has to work all around, especially for public companies. You have shareholder obligations and all that stuff. But there are issues, and I'll give a couple examples, that are very much in line with those objectives, but are also for the better good of the world and some of these issues. So let's see, I'll do migration first. So our CEO and the CEO from Google brought together a bunch of other CEOs in the US to form something called welcome.us, which is essentially to work with the US government to help with private resettlement of refugees. It started with Afghan and Ukrainians, now it's expanded. And the power in that's why I said the collective power is quite amazing, because not just for visibility and accelerating efforts, but what they can tangibly bring to the effort, right? A diverse group of companies, MasterCard's part of that as well, is quite remarkable. And so that's been a good example of, it was CEO leadership, support from the government, but it was a private sector idea to bring this together and work with government to provide things that government frankly can't do fast enough. So that was one, I think, really positive example. And then to bring it to AI, I think it's super relevant. We are doing a lot with our clients, and our clients are all sort of big companies, right? So it's an interesting perspective. But we do a lot around AI, and I personally am doing a lot with AI governance and how to take it forward on a global basis. And we actually, I think yesterday, WEF announced a report that we helped contribute to on global governance for AI. And one of the themes is the need to have it be an inclusive group. There's a real risk, and that's why I think WEF has a good position here, that things get decided sort of at the G7 or even the G20, right? And of course, there's stuff to learn from all those institutions, but and the UN is in the game as well, which is terrific, but they don't get the same private sector input, right? So you need this government, civil society, academia, and corporate in a diverse way to really have this be a sustainable, wherever we land on this stuff, for it to be sustainable and not exacerbate problems. So those are just two examples where I think companies driving and insisting on certain frameworks can be really helpful.